Welcome to Empire Economics. I'm truly grateful you're here, because today we're exploring a hidden side of World War I that history books often overlook. While most stories focus on generals and battles, this one starts in boardrooms and private banks. What if the Great War wasn't just driven by politics, but by profit? What if the most influential bankers of the early 20th century quietly shaped the events that led to war, not through violence, but through loans, credit, and carefully timed decisions? This isn't theory. It's a story of global finance, national power, and how money moved behind the scenes of one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. So if you're curious about how economics can influence empires, make sure to hit like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to Empire Economics. Let's uncover the story few dare to tell. When you think about World War I, you probably imagine trenches, poison gas, and millions of young men marching off to die for king and country. But behind every great war lies a simple truth that history books rarely emphasize. Wars are expensive, catastrophically expensive, and someone has to pay for them. What if I told you that some of the wealthiest bankers in the world didn't just profit from the Great War? They helped orchestrate the financial conditions that made it inevitable. What if the conflict that reshaped the 20th century wasn't just about nationalism or imperial rivalry, but about cold financial calculation by men who saw human tragedy as business opportunity? By 1918, approximately 21,000 Americans had become millionaires or billionaires directly from wartime profits. But this wasn't random luck or patriotic investment. This was the result of a carefully constructed financial web that had been spinning for decades before the first shot was fired. The story begins not in the trenches of France, but in the marble halls of Wall Street and the private clubs of international banking. By 1914, a small network of financial houses controlled more capital than most nations. These weren't just banks the traditional sense. They were engines of global influence, capable of funding armies, toppling governments, and reshaping entire continents through the strategic deployment of credit. Consider the scale of what we're discussing. By the spring of 1917, American bankers had loaned the Allied powers nearly $3 billion, with an additional $6 billion committed to exports and war materials. To put this in perspective, that represented more money than the entire gross domestic product of most European nations at the time. Steel companies, munitions manufacturers, chemical producers, and agricultural exporters had all restructured their entire operations around wartime demand. But here's where the story gets fascinating. These loans weren't distributed randomly or based purely on patriotic sentiment. They followed a very specific pattern, orchestrated by a remarkably small group of financial institutions that had positioned themselves as the exclusive intermediaries between warring nations and American capital. At the center of this web sat J.P. Morgan Jr., whose firm had been one of the key architects of the Federal Reserve System just 1 year before the war began. Morgan didn't just loan money to governments. He became their purchasing agent, their financial advisor, and their gateway to American industrial capacity. When Russia needed capital, they went through Morgan. When France required munitions, Morgan arranged both the financing and the contracts. When Britain needed to purchase American steel, Morgan's firms collected commissions on both sides of every transaction. This wasn't coincidental. Morgan had systematically positioned his network to capture a percentage of virtually every financial transaction related to the war effort. His firms would loan money to Allied governments, then immediately receive much of that money back as those same governments purchased American goods from companies within Morgan's sphere of influence. The beauty of this arrangement was that Morgan collected fees coming and going, while the risk remained with the borrowing nations and the American taxpayers, who would ultimately guarantee these debts. But the Morgan network was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The international banking system in 1914 was dominated by families whose financial tentacles stretched across national boundaries in ways that would seem impossible today. The Warburg family provides perhaps the most striking example of this global financial web. Paul Warburg sat on the Federal Reserve Board as its vice chairman, helping to direct American monetary policy during the war. Meanwhile, his brother Max served as the Kaiser's personal banker and held a leadership position in German intelligence operations. The same family was simultaneously financing both sides of the conflict, while occupying positions of enormous influence within the financial systems of the opposing nations. This wasn't an aberration or a conflict of interest that somehow slipped through regulatory cracks. This was the normal operating procedure of international banking in the early 20th century. These financial networks had grown so large and so interconnected that they transcended national loyalties. Their primary allegiance was to profit and the expansion of their own influence. The Warburg brothers weren't secretly conspiring to prolong the war. They were simply operating according to the logic of their business model. Wars created enormous demand for capital, and they were in the business of supplying capital to anyone who could pay their fees and meet their terms. National boundaries were less important than financial relationships. This pattern extended far beyond the Warburg family. Jacob Schiff, another prominent American banker, had previously demonstrated how financial power could reshape geopolitical outcomes during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Schiff had provided Japan with $200 million in financing, roughly half of what that nation needed to defeat Russia. His motivation wasn't primarily business calculation, but rather a desire to punish the Russian Empire for its treatment of Jewish populations. When Japan achieved its stunning victory over Russia, the global financial community took notice. Schiff's strategic lending had proven that private bankers could determine the outcome of conflicts between major powers. The lesson was clear: control the flow of capital, and you control the course of history. This precedent would prove crucial in understanding what happened a decade later when Europe descended into chaos. The same financial networks that had shaped the Russo-Japanese conflict were now positioned to influence a war of unprecedented scale and profitability. By 1914, the international banking system had evolved into something far more sophisticated than simple lending institutions. These financial houses had become the circulatory system of the global economy, pumping capital from one nation to another based on calculations that transcended traditional diplomatic relationships. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, the immediate political reactions dominated newspaper headlines. But in the private offices of major banking houses, a different kind of calculation was taking place. War meant massive government borrowing. Government borrowing meant enormous profits for those institutions capable of organizing and underwriting sovereign debt on the scale that modern warfare demanded. The mobilization of finance preceded the mobilization of armies. Within weeks of the war's outbreak, Morgan's representatives were in contact with British and French officials, not just to offer assistance, but to position themselves as the exclusive financial pipeline between Allied governments and American markets. This wasn't patriotic charity. This was business strategy on a scale that few people could comprehend. The numbers reveal the magnitude of what was actually happening. Morgan's commission structure was set at 8.3% of every transaction his firms facilitated. When you're organizing $500 million bond offerings and managing the purchase of millions of dollars in war materials, those percentages translate into fortunes that dwarf the wealth of most European aristocrats. But the most remarkable aspect of this financial arrangement was how it created powerful incentives for prolonging and escalating the conflict. Every month that the war continued meant additional loans, more purchasing contracts, and higher commissions for the banking networks that had positioned themselves as intermediaries. By 1916, American financial institutions had become so deeply invested in Allied victory that a German triumph would have represented a catastrophic loss for Wall Street. Hundreds of millions of dollars in loans would become worthless overnight. Entire industries that had retooled for wartime production would collapse. The financial elite who had built their wealth on wartime lending faced potential ruin if their borrowers lost the conflict. This created a dynamic that historians rarely discuss openly. The same bankers who were financing the war effort also had enormous influence over American political leaders and public opinion. When it became clear that the Allies might actually lose without American military intervention, these financial interests began advocating for policies that would protect their investments. The Federal Reserve, which had been established just 3 years before the war began, became the mechanism through which this financial mobilization was accomplished. Rather than relying on taxation alone to fund American participation in the conflict, the government began issuing debt that the Fed would purchase by creating new dollars. This allowed the war to be financed through monetary expansion rather than immediate sacrifice by American taxpayers. The Great War ended in 1918, but the financial networks that profited from it remained intact, evolving into the modern banking system we know today. Understanding this history isn't about assigning blame to the past, but about recognizing patterns that continue to shape our world. When you see how financial incentives can influence global events, you begin to understand that economics and politics are inseparable forces. The lessons from 1914 remind us that behind every major historical event lies a web of financial relationships that often determine outcomes more than the political narratives we're taught. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly echoes. If this changed how you think about financial power and historical events, hit subscribe. The patterns are still there if you know where to look.